My son told me I wasn't welcome at his wedding. Then, 3 days later, he sent me a bill for $87,000 and expected me to say thank you. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years at a paper mill outside Sudbury, Ontario. I drove the same truck for 14 years because it still ran and I didn't need a new one. I clipped grocery coupons. I made my own lunch every single day, not because I was poor. I did all right for myself, but because that's how my father raised me, and I believed in it. You don't spend money you haven't earned. You don't take what isn't yours. And you certainly don't send your retired father an invoice for your honeymoon in Banff. But my son did. His name is Connor. He's 31 now. And his fiancée, her name is Isabel, comes from a family in North Vancouver that has never once in their lives waited for anything. Her father, Warren, is the kind of man who wears a watch that costs more than my truck and talks about legacy wealth at the dinner table like it's a normal conversation. The first time I met him, he looked at my flannel shirt and smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile. I should have known then, but Connor was happy. And when your son is happy, you tell yourself the rest doesn't matter. It started to unravel about 8 months before the wedding. Connor called me one evening, not to chat, not to catch up, but to tell me that the venue they had chosen, a resort property outside Whistler, required a deposit of $30,000 within the week. He said Warren was covering half. He said he and Isabel were covering a portion. And then there was a pause, the kind of pause that means someone is about to ask you for something. Dad, we were hoping you could help with the rest. The rest was $18,000. I told him I needed a few days to think about it. He said that was fine. But the next morning, Isabel called me. Not Connor, Isabel. And she wasn't asking. She was explaining, in a very pleasant tone, how important this day was, how the venue had limited availability, how Warren had already been generous, and how it would mean so much if I could just do my part. I don't know when I became a line item in their budget, but somewhere between Connor moving to Vancouver for Isabel's sake and the two of them renting a condo in Kitsilano with heated floors, I had become exactly that. I sent the $18,000. I didn't feel good about it, but I sent it because he was my son. Then came the caterer. Then came the photographer, a woman who apparently flew in from Montreal and charged accordingly. Then came the floral arrangements, which, as far as I could tell, were going to cost more than my first car. Each time, Connor would call. Each time, the number was different, but the message was the same. Warren's contributing his share, we're contributing ours. We just need you to meet us in the middle. By December, I had contributed just over $40,000. I hadn't been asked whether I wanted to. I hadn't been shown a budget. I just kept getting calls, and I kept being the kind of father who answered them. Then, one afternoon in January, Connor phoned and told me that Isabel's parents felt it would be cleaner if the wedding party stayed within their immediate social circle. I didn't understand at first, so he explained. They didn't want me at the ceremony. He said it carefully. He said it was nothing personal. He said the Hargrove family, that was Isabel's family name, Hargrove, had certain expectations about the atmosphere, and that Warren felt my presence might create tension. I asked what kind of tension. Connor went quiet for a moment, and then said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. Dad, you know how you can be. I don't know how I can be. I've never been anything but decent to those people. I shook Warren's hand. I complimented their home. I brought a good bottle of Niagara wine to their dinner table. But apparently, somewhere in all of that, I had become a problem to be managed. I told Connor I needed to think. What I actually needed was to sit down, because my legs had gone a little weak. I sat in my kitchen for a long time that night. The house was quiet. My wife, Connor's mother, passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer, just after Christmas. I've been on my own since. The house still has her curtains in the living room, because I don't have the heart to change them. I sat under those curtains, and I thought about the boy I raised. I thought about driving him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning. I thought about the year I worked overtime every weekend so he could go on a school trip to Quebec City. I thought about the day he left for university and how proud I was, how full the feeling was, and how I'd told myself that all the years of showing up had been worth it. I thought about $40,000. Then I went to bed. 3 days later, a document arrived in my email. Connor had sent it. The subject line said Wedding Contribution Summary. When I opened it, it was a spreadsheet. My name was at the top. Below it was an itemized list of remaining wedding expenses, with a column on the right showing what portion was expected from me. The total at the bottom was $87,000. That covered the balance on the venue, the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant in Gastown I'd never been invited to, the wedding night suite, and the honeymoon, 7 nights at the Fairmont Banff Springs. At the bottom of the email, Connor had written, "Dad, we really appreciate everything you've been doing. This will cover the rest of what we need. Let us know if you have any questions." No, please. No phone call first. Just a spreadsheet and a number, and the assumption that I would open my savings account and transfer the money because that's what I always did. I read that email 4 times, and then I called my brother in Timmins, a man named Glenn who has never once sugarcoated anything in his life, and I read it to him out loud. Glenn said, "Len, close your wallet and don't say sorry." That was the moment something shifted in me. I didn't respond to the email that day. I didn't respond the next day either. On the 3rd day, Connor called and asked if I'd had a chance to review the summary. I told him yes, I had reviewed it. I told him I wasn't going to pay it. The silence on the other end of the line was very long. Then he said, "Dad, we've been counting on this." I said, "I know. I shouldn't have let you count on it." He said Isabel was going to be devastated. He said Warren was going to wonder what kind of family they were marrying into. He said this was my grandson's future wedding story. And did I really want to be the reason it wasn't what they'd planned? I said, "Connor, I wasn't invited to the wedding." Another long silence. Then he said they could probably find a spot for me near the back. Near the back. At my own son's wedding. I told him that wasn't going to work for me. And I told him, calmly, that I'd be speaking to a financial advisor about the contributions I'd already made. Because $40,000 is not a gift when it's extracted by pressure and given under the impression it would be followed by gratitude rather than invoices. He hung up. The next week was very unpleasant. Connor sent messages. Isabel sent messages. Warren actually called me once, from his cell phone, in his polished Vancouver voice, and explained that they had vendors who had been paid deposits, and that if I was going to cause disruption this close to the event, there would be consequences. I wrote down the word consequences and underlined it twice. Then I called a lawyer friend of mine, a woman I've known since the 80s named Patricia. Wait, no, her name was Anne-Marie Collette, a woman from Sudbury who had become a family law attorney, and I asked her what my options were. She asked me if I had records of the transfers. I did. Every single one. Bank statements, email threads, text messages where Connor had explicitly said what each contribution was for. Anne-Marie told me that in Ontario, money given in anticipation of a wedding can sometimes be recovered if the circumstances meet certain criteria, particularly if it was requested under pressure, if it was not framed as a gift, and if the giving party was excluded from the event the money was intended for. She said it wasn't guaranteed. She said it would depend on documentation and the willingness to pursue it. But she said the case was not without merit. I told her to start the paperwork. I also did one other thing. I called Connor's uncle on his mother's side, a quiet man named Douglas, someone Connor had always respected, and I told Douglas everything, not to gossip, not to build an army, just because Douglas had known Connor since he was born, and I thought someone in that family should know what was happening. Douglas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Len, his mother would be sick over this." That hit me harder than anything else had. The wedding happened in April. I was not there. I sat at home that Saturday with a pot of coffee and a book I couldn't focus on, and I thought about the venue outside Whistler, the flowers, the Fairmont suite in Banff. I thought about all of it, and I felt a grief that was hard to name. Not quite anger, not quite sadness, something heavier than both. But I didn't send the $87,000. 2 months later, the legal process had begun in earnest. Anne-Marie had sent a formal letter to Connor outlining the claim for the return of the $40,000, citing the conditions under which it had been requested and the fact that I had been explicitly excluded from the event. Connor's response, drafted through a lawyer Isabel's family had hired, argued that the money had been given voluntarily and constituted personal gifts with no strings attached. Anne-Marie sent back the emails, the spreadsheet, the text messages where Connor had written things like, "We need the venue deposit by Friday," and "Isabel says the florist won't hold without confirmation." She sent the email with the $87,000 summary, and the words, "Let us know if you have any questions." She also sent the email where Connor had explained I was being excluded from the ceremony because of family dynamics. The lawyer on the other side went quiet for several weeks. In the meantime, something else happened. Douglas reached out to other family members, Connor's cousins, two aunts on his mother's side, who had not known any of this was happening. By June, Connor was getting phone calls from people who had known him his whole life, asking him quietly and seriously what he had done to his father. He couldn't spin it. There was too much documentation, and the family was too tight-knit for the Hargrove version of events to take hold. I heard through Douglas that there had been significant conflict between Connor and Isabel over how the situation had been handled. That Isabel's version of events was that it had all been a misunderstanding, that she'd never intended for me to feel excluded. But the emails were in black and white, and Warren, who had apparently told Connor that his new father-in-law would sort it out, had gone conspicuously silent. In late August, Connor called me, not through a lawyer. Just him, on a Sunday evening. He asked if he could come to Sudbury. He drove up the following weekend. I made a pot of chili the way I've always made it, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands while I waited. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, thinner than I remembered, quieter than he'd been in years. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table he'd done homework at as a kid, the same table where his mother used to sit on Sunday mornings with her tea. He looked at the table for a long time before he spoke. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood what was happening until he was already deep in the middle of it. He said the pressure from Isabel's family had been constant and suffocating from the moment they got engaged, and that he had taken the path of least resistance so many times that he'd lost track of where he was. He said excluding me from the ceremony had been Isabel's suggestion, and that he had gone along with it because he didn't know how to fight Warren Hargrove and still come home to the same house. He said none of that excused what he'd done. I sat across from him and looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw a man who had made choices he couldn't undo and was living with the weight of that. I wasn't going to make it easier than it deserved to be, but I wasn't going to be cold about it either. He was still my son. He would always be my son. I told him I appreciated him coming. I told him we had a lot of ground to rebuild. I told him the legal matter was going to run its course regardless, because $40,000 isn't something I can simply absorb at 63 years old, and because I thought it was important that he understand the real cost of what had happened, not just emotionally, but in every way. He nodded. He said he understood. He ate 2 bowls of chili and drove back to Vancouver that same night. The legal matter settled in October, without going to trial. Connor and Isabel agreed to repay $32,000 of the $40,000 I had contributed, paid in installments over 18 months. It wasn't everything. Anne-Marie had told me to expect that. But it was acknowledgement. Formal, documented acknowledgement that the money had not been a gift freely given, that I had been wronged, and that there were real consequences to treating your father like a line item. I deposited the first installment the week before Remembrance Day. I've thought a lot, since all of this, about what I would have done differently. I would have said no sooner. I would have asked for a budget in writing before I transferred a single dollar. I would have understood earlier that generosity without boundaries isn't generosity. It's an invitation for people to take more than they're owed. My neighbor asked me recently how I was doing. I told her fine. She asked about Connor. I said we were talking again, carefully, the way you talk to someone when trust has been damaged but not completely lost. She said that sounded hopeful. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said I supposed it was. I still have his mother's curtains in the living room. I haven't changed them. But some mornings now, when the light comes through at the right angle, I sit with my coffee and I let myself believe that the worst of it is behind us. That Connor is figuring out who he is outside of that marriage, outside of that family's orbit, that there's still time for him to become the man I raised him to mean. You don't stop being a father just because your son forgets, for a while, what that means. But you do stop writing the checks.